place in Rome called the Church of the Holy. It's actually the Basilica of the Holy Cross in Jerusalem, but it is in Rome. It's just a short walk, actually, from St. John Lateran. And any of you that got my email on Friday know that there was a photograph that I attached to that email of my own pilgrimage to Santa Croce in Jerusalem, which is, as I said, in Rome. And there are some incredible relics that are housed there. A lot of people I've learned don't really even know about it. I don't think it's on one of the tourists. It's not necessarily a tourist hotspot in Rome to go, but more people should, because it's really a fascinating story about how the mother of the first Christian Roman emperor, Constantine I, Constantine the Great, his mother, St. Helena, made an archaeological expedition to the Holy Land on her own at the age of 79. She was 80 when she returned to Rome, and she led an amateur Indiana Jones adventure to try to find Golgotha and to try to find any of the relics of the Passion that she could locate. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today, because there is a miracle that's involved, and so keeping with our theme of miracles, there's a couple of miracles involved in this story, and it's also just a lot of fun to talk about. So I want you to imagine that you lived at the time of Christ. If you would imagine this for just a moment, perhaps you witnessed the crucifixion. Okay, you saw where they took his body and laid it. You began to hear that he was alive, that he had resurrected. And just imagine yourself as sort of being a spectator to that, a spectator to probably what would have been, without question, the most significant event in the history of humanity. And you were sort of on the sidelines or a spectator to it, an eyewitness to that. You had seen the incarnate God. You had been a part of that experience. Would you remember those events? Would you remember those places? Would you remember where they took him? Would you know the spot? Would you take your children there? You see, this is how oral tradition begins. And so whenever I give this talk, I'm always aware that there are people, and we'll just deal with the skepticism right up front, there are people who would say, well, you know, St. Helena lived 300 years after Christ. And so after 300 years, who knows where Golgotha was? Who knows where the tomb was? How could she possibly have found that? Well, and my answer to that always is, you know, we commemorate things. We do it in our own lives. We build monuments on top of sites that are important. And we remember, and we pass that down by oral tradition. If not in writing, we pass it down through tradition, and that's how it begins. So you can guarantee that when St. Helena showed up in Jerusalem in the year 326, the Bishop of Jerusalem, who we'll talk about in a minute, had already been in correspondence with the emperor, suggesting that he knew where these sites were. And so remember that Constantine is the first Christian Roman emperor. Every emperor before him had been pagan. So emperors before him discouraged Christians from visiting these holy sites. And how did they discourage it? By building pagan temples on top of them. Which is kind of like saying X marks the spot, right? Here it is. Here's a temple of Apollo built on the site of the Holy Sepulchre. So, you know, I would say that to the skeptics that and I'm not suggesting that there's any of you in here, but yes, 300 years is a long time to pass between the time of Christ and the first archaeological expedition to the Holy Land. But it's certainly within the realm of reason to think that people would have commemorated and marked these places and known these places for sure. So let's consider some of the relics today that are associated with the Passion of Christ, because that's what St. Helena is known for. All instruments of the Passion, remember, are considered first-class relics. All instruments of the Passion are considered first-class relics. Specifically, we're going to narrow our focus to talk about the ones, actually really, in detail, really only two. We're going to look at the true cross and explore some of the myth and fact about that. And then we're going to talk about something called the titulus crucis, or the title of the cross, which is also held as part of the true cross in the Church of the Basilica of the Holy Cross in Jerusalem in Rome. Okay? Does everybody hear me say that? I keep saying the Church of the Holy Cross in Jerusalem, but it is in Rome. Yeah, so I always have to add in Rome. So the St. Helena's statue, this is actually the background here. This is St. Peter's Basilica, and Pope Urban VIII actually commissioned this under Bernini, who was the main architect, of course, and sculptor of much of the statuary in St. Peter's. And she is one actually of 4 large statues that are in corners. There is an altar beneath this that contains a large piece of the true cross. You see St. Helena, she's always depicted with a cross in her iconography. As a matter of fact, John, where's John? Bradford. Way up there. Yeah, he brought some small little icons. And you got them in Jerusalem. One of them in Jerusalem, one of them in Rome.
That's right.
Okay. They're actually very beautiful. But you always see her depicted with a cross, holding a cross, of course, because of her association with this. Okay, so we've all heard some of these stories. I mean, the Holy Grail. Okay, the Holy Grail. The crown of thorns. The Holy Lance, right? The spear that pierced Jesus' side. The true cross. We can dispense pretty quickly with at least one of these, and I'm going to dispense very quickly with the Holy Grail, because that is Arthurian legend. And I'm not saying that there wasn't a Grail, but the legend is that, and everybody know when I say Grail, I'm talking about the cup that Jesus drank from at the Last Supper. No matter what the author Dan Brown says, that's what the Holy Grail is. The story, the legend appeared very quickly in Britannia, in the Roman province of Britannia in Britain, that Joseph of Arimathea had taken the Holy Grail to Britain, and that he was one of the 70 who were sent out. And that he took the Grail to Britain, specifically to a little place on the Salisbury Plain called Glastonbury. If you've ever been there, you know that there is one of the most famous sites there at the ruins of Glastonbury Abbey is something called the Chalice Well, where the water runs blood red from this well, and it tastes like blood. There's a heavy iron content in the water, of course, too. But the legend is that Joseph of Arimathea took the Grail to Britain, and he either misplaced it. I know, that's one version of the story. Can you imagine having one of the most holy relics in all of Christendom and losing it? I wouldn't tell anybody either. But that's one of the stories, is that he misplaced it. The other one is that he left it for safekeeping at Glastonbury, and that's the reason it's at the bottom of this well, and that's the reason that the water runs red. But that story makes its way into Arthurian legend, so that the Grail sort of becomes inextricably linked to the legend of King Arthur, and so it's very difficult to parse out any real history there about that. It is pure legend. I'd like to believe it, of course, but that really is legend. So, and of course, it became sort of the theme, remember, of a fabulous Monty Python movie too, right? Come on, tell me y'all aren't Monty Python fans? I don't know if I can talk to you this morning. Everybody know the movie I'm talking about? Monty Python and the Search for the Holy Grail? Thank you. The Crown of Thorns. Okay, so the Crown of Thorns is at Notre Dame Cathedral, or what's left of it. Lots of thorns, of course, would have been distributed through the centuries, so that today what you see when it's on display, which is some Fridays and Good Friday, is sort of a ring of rushes that looks like thornless twigs, really, that are bound together by gold thread. And there is an interesting history that is associated with that particular relic. There are 70 pieces of the Crown of Thorns, at last count that I'm aware of, that this has sort of been investigated, that people claim to have throughout the world. And, well, I should say there are more than 70, but of the ones that are known, 70 of them have similar enough characteristics botanically that we believe they are in fact related and probably came from the same plant. So, but there are literally hundreds that are scattered around the world. So, Today, if you see the crown of thorns, you're not going to see any thorns. That's my point, is it's a circle of canes bundled with gold thread. So the accounts of pilgrims provide some really rich primary source documents for us, pilgrims to the Holy Land. Beginning in the 5th century, we have some accounts from pilgrims on their way to Jerusalem that they had seen a crown of thorns and that they had seen the instruments of the Passion, and beginning really about the year 400 to about 800. You've got lots of these accounts. At least 4 Christian writers in the 5th century mention specifically the crown of thorns being one of the relics that was kept at Mount Zion, Basilica on Mount Zion in Jerusalem. So then between like the 7th and the 10th centuries, from about 600 to about 900, the relics were moved progressively from Jerusalem to the Byzantine emperor's private palace in Constantinople. Okay, and we really think that this happened because there was concern about their safekeeping. There was concern about keeping them from being lost or from pillaging. Much like what was suffered by the Church of the Holy Sepulchre because of the Persian invasions. There was some worry about getting these relics out of Jerusalem. So in the early 13th century, if you fast forward from there, we have a pretty good idea that there were Passion relics that were held in Constantinople in the 9th and 10th centuries. And if you fast forward from there to the 13th century, the beginning of the 13th century, at the time of the Fourth Crusade, which was really the one that was the true commercial debacle that resulted in the sacking of the city by Christian soldiers, by Western Christian soldiers, sacked the city of Constantinople. And they placed what we call the Latin emperor on the throne of Byzantium. His name was Baldwin. And Emperor Baldwin, I'm going to say this as kindly as I can, he was in great financial difficulty because he had a little bit of a gambling problem. And he began to sell some of these relics. And one of them apparently was the crown of thorns, which he sold. Actually, he pawned it to a Venetian bank, okay, to advance a line of credit. So he pawned the crown of thorns to the Venetian bank to get credit. And supposedly, this is how it ended up in the hands of King St. Louis IX of France. How he came to possess it is because he realized it was being held basically in hock by a bank. And so he purchased it, and he put it in Notre Dame Cathedral. We know from his own private papers and diaries that he presented this every Friday for people to see in Notre Dame, every Friday for several years. Then it became the first Friday, and then eventually it was only on Good Friday. So we got a pretty good chain of custody of that, certainly from Constantinople. And together with these accounts from pilgrims, going back to the 5th century, we don't really have any reason to doubt that somebody believed that this was, in fact, the actual crown of thorns. The Holy Lance, the spear that was used to pierce Jesus' side, mentioned only in the Gospel of John. Remember, the Gospel states that the Romans planned to break Jesus' legs. Remember this? A practice known as crufragrium, which actually means to end someone's suffering. So to make sure that he was dead, the Roman soldier pierced the side. And of course, there is this wonderful story. Actually, there's an extra biblical tradition, meaning outside of the Bible, tradition that this Roman soldier had a name. Does anybody know what his name was? Longinus. That's right. That's right. That's tradition only. That is extra biblical. It is not found in the gospel accounts. We don't have any historical record of Longinus, but that's what we call him. And so John tells us that one of the soldiers pierced his side with a lance, and immediately there came out blood and water. So the early church fathers, particularly someone named Origen of Alexandria, really used this metaphorically. Saw this very much, not metaphorically, but as an allegory, that this was a way to teach the mystery of the Eucharist. This blood and water, that Jesus was both fully man and fully God, and that the blood symbolized his humanity and the water symbolized his divinity. So he used that as a great teaching tool. That's all a beautiful tradition, and it resulted in some great teachings about the mysteries of our faith. But is the Holy Lance really somewhere where you can see it? Well, let me tell you, there are 3 of them. Okay? There are 3 of them. So we don't have any actual lance that appears except in one account. There is again, it's a 6th century pilgrim who tells us that he's visiting these holy places in Jerusalem, and in the Basilica of Mount Zion, he says that he saw, quote, the crown of thorns with which our Lord was crowned and the lance with which he was struck in the side. But as I said, today there are 3 of them. So if in fact there was one at Mount Zion held with the other Passion relics, I can't give you a really good historical chain of custody as to where it ended up, because there is one at the Vatican. Actually, there is a statue, and those 4 statues I talked about, the 4 statuary. There is one, I can't remember if it's next to her or across from her, that is Saint Longinus. And there's supposedly, that's where at this altar is where this particular spear is kept. But the church is very silent about it. Remember that the church doesn't speak to the authenticity of any relic, only if it is worthy of veneration. So there is one at the Vatican. There's a second one in a church in Armenia that was found during the First Crusade and brought back to the Armenian Orthodox Church. And the third one is held in Vienna. And the one that's in Vienna is the so-called Spear of Destiny that so much has been written about. If you read conspiracy theory novels, you'll remember that the Spear of Destiny is associated with Adolf Hitler. This was supposedly one of the relics that he was obsessed with trying to get possession of. So, now, to get to some more of the serious aspects of our search for relics, though. Certainly, the Crown of Thorns, I think we can attach some good historicity to. I'm not so certain about either the Holy Grail or the spear. But, according to history and tradition, St. Helena, Constantine's mother, at the age of 79, made a journey across the entirety of her son's dominions to Jerusalem, the furthest point in the empire. And from that journey springs all of the relics of the true cross that exist in the world today. We'll talk about how many that is. The rest we kind of have to surmise from, piece together accounts, both from those who were present in Jerusalem, who were part of this expedition, and from 2 major church historians who both have very early good accounts of this. Because we actually know very little about her. Her history, her life, we know very little of, except of course that we can assume that she was a devout Christian. We know that she converted to Christianity after her son did, her son the emperor. We know that he was quite devoted to her. We can certainly tell that he was devoted to her from the sheer number of coins that were in circulation that had her image struck on the front. Her image struck on the front of the coin with the title Augusta. So we know that he had incredible devotion to his mother as well. We know that she lived very grandly, very comfortably. He provided her with a very nice palace in Rome, which we're going to talk about. This church is actually, at the subterranean level, was part of that original palace complex that he built for her in the 4th century. St. Ambrose gives us some insight about her. He says that she is, quote, of humble origin. He calls her an innkeeper before her son rose to the ranks of Roman emperor. Now, I'm just going to give you a word of caution here. Innkeeper could mean a lot of things in the 4th century. I'm just saying. I'm throwing that out there. We don't know that. We certainly know that, for instance, by the 6th century, Justinian's wife, the Emperor Justinian's wife, was also referred to as an innkeeper, and we know what she really did. Yeah. She ran a brothel. Yeah. So, I'm not saying that. Don't take that away. Don't say that I said St. Helena owned a brothel. But we do have to read that very carefully. He calls her an innkeeper, and it may simply be that that's sort of a moniker that's used for anyone who is of humble origin at the time. We know that, as I said, that her son truly revered her. And following her conversion to Christianity is when she decided that she was going to go to the Holy Land. And who can blame her for that, right? So, she not only had the full endorsement of her son, the emperor, to do this, but she had a blank check from the imperial treasury. A blank check to spend as much as she needed to. So she goes to Jerusalem. Now, the general area of Christ's death and resurrection was not really in doubt in the 4th century, that general area. The Gospels are pretty clear in their description of the site. Outside the city walls, a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull, a hill known as Calvary. She certainly wasn't going in there with no idea about where this might be. And there is a rocky mount that was known to be this area. Christian pilgrims had visited there through the centuries. As I said, previous emperors, Hadrian, for instance, built a temple on top of it to discourage Christian pilgrims. So that the Romans actually make the task of finding it much, much easier. Church historian, that you've heard me mention him before, but and he's actually probably the only real source for the church up to Constantine. Eusebius of Caesarea, church historian. I'm going to be drawing very heavily upon some of the correspondence that he saw, that he recounts in his secondary source, okay? Eusebius of Caesarea. He tells us that hundreds of people were employed in this dig. When she went to the Holy Land, she employed hundreds of people. Buildings, temples, terraces, all torn down around the general area. Several tons of dirt was apparently removed from the site. And after about 10 weeks, he tells us, the limestone hill of Calvary was exposed. He goes on to say, the workers continued to work away at the limestone to separate the holy hill, he calls it the holy hill, from the surrounding rock. Suddenly, a ditch of 3 crosses was exposed. And Eusebius uses this word, that it was a miracle. The Bishop of Jerusalem, whose account Eusebius also cites, Macarius, the Bishop of Jerusalem declared, quote, make known to us, O Lord, which of these 3 crosses served for your glory, end quote. And again, this is recorded in both Eusebius of Caesarea's history and in a record, just a few decades later, a record that's recorded by St. Cyril of Jerusalem, Bishop of Jerusalem in the 380s. So we're not very far removed from this. And St. Cyril claims that he had also seen this letter of Bishop Macarius. So according to these accounts, a dying woman was brought to the site, and one by one the crosses touched her. One by one, she was touched to the 3 crosses. As the 3rd cross touched her, she suddenly rose and walked. Okay? So, St. Helena herself commanded on the spot that this was the true cross. The bishop had asked for the miracle. The woman was cured. There were 3 crosses there. And remember that, okay, so the gospel accounts do tell us there was an earthquake, right? So apparently these 3 crosses were in fact, from all the accounts we have, were in fact buried in a ditch, in a gully, together. Because you know that the Romans reused crosses. You know that. You know that. Certainly, perhaps the vertical support they would have used over and over and over again. And each individual criminal would have been expected to carry the crossbar, parabellum. So, it's a miracle. And that this woman is cured. St. Helena pronounced it the true cross. She also commanded that it be divided. That one part would be left in Jerusalem, in the Holy City. One part would be taken to Constantinople, which was, of course, by this time, the second imperial capital. And another would be taken to Rome, which she took back to the palace compound that her son had built for her. And there she had a private chapel, which you'll see a picture of in a minute. She had a private chapel, and that's where this particular piece of the true cross was taken. That's the one that the slivers have been taken from throughout the centuries. The piece that was taken to Rome. These pieces now reported to be, of course, all over the world. Every cathedral in the world has one. We have one here. So we're going to talk more about that in a minute, about how many and how do we know and all that.
How much smaller has it become of the process?
Right. And we're talking very, very tiny slivers anyway that were taken. I mean, I think the one we have here you can barely see, right? But doesn't make it any less a first-class relic. So we have a 4th century pilgrim who actually, this is interesting reading. I mean, just for the sake of reading an account of a pilgrim to the Holy Land, she's very, very descriptive. And it reads almost kind of like a novel at some points. A 4th century pilgrim named Etheria, she also is known in some Latin text as Sylvia. She recounted in this great primary source. This is a great primary source because she's an eyewitness. And again, it's rather invaluable because of just how descriptive she is. She doesn't leave a sentence or two. She tells how, being in Jerusalem, she knew that the true cross was venerated there about 380. She leaves a very, as I said, great account about that particular rite. 380, the Bishop of Jerusalem was St. Cyril. So she tells us this, quote, on Good Friday at 8 o'clock in the morning, the faithful assemble in the chapel of the cross. And she goes on to say, built on a site by Calvary. She tells us exactly where it was. And at this spot, the ceremony of the adoration takes place. The bishop is seated on his chair. Before him is a table covered with a cloth. The deacons are standing around him. The silver gilt reliquary is brought and opened, and the sacred wood of the cross with the title, more about that in a minute, with the title is placed on the table. The bishop stretches out his hand over the holy relic, and the deacons keep watch with him while the faithful and the catechumens come forward, one by one, before the table, bow and kiss the cross. And they touch the cross and the title with their forehead and eyes. You see how descriptive she is? I'm still quoting her, by the way. But it is forbidden to touch them with the hands. This watchfulness was not unnecessary, for I have been told, in fact, how one day, one of the faithful, making as though to kiss the cross, was so unscrupulous as to bite off a piece of it, which he carried off as a relic. It is the duty of the deacons to prevent the repetition of such a crime. Okay, so she gives great description of the Good Friday adoration of the cross. St. Cyril also, of course, tells us about the ceremony, but not nearly in that much kind of the detail. He makes his account much more brief and to the point. But he adds the important detail to his account that pieces of this cross left in Jerusalem were also being distributed. Okay? So, while St. Helena requested that only the one taken to Rome be taken apart, basically, St. Cyril tells us that this was already happening at the end of the 4th century to the one that was held in Jerusalem. And incidentally, I want to add this too. The Good Friday service that we have for the adoration of the true cross, or it was called the adoration of the true cross, the adoration of the cross today, has its liturgical origin in Jerusalem in the 4th century with St. Cyril, and it is basically unchanged. It is basically unchanged, very consistent with that. So again, another really, I think, important link to those Christians who've come before us, that we are observing liturgically the same things, the same way that they did. Both of these accounts, Etheria and St. Cyril, add some veracity to the tradition about St. Helena's finds. And this is, as I said, within decades of her expedition. So because of this, pilgrimages to the Holy Land really began to increase, really became more frequent. St. Jerome, who's describing in his text the pilgrimage of St. Paula, he tells us, quote, that prostrate before the true cross, she adored it as though she had seen the Savior hanging upon it. This is an excellent practice to be emulated by us all. So this really, really gets entrenched in our tradition. Of course, St. Helena also located, and before I get back to the cross, she also located what she believed was the only tomb large enough nearby to have been that which belonged to Joseph of Arimathea. By tradition, it was the site that Christians had made early pilgrimages to. And so because of that discovery, Constantine built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the first of those churches on top of that site that she found. Okay, so this is the Basilica of the Holy Cross in Jerusalem, in Rome. Okay, this is in Rome, just a short walk from St. John Lateran. And this entire complex, what you're looking at here, is really mostly a 15th century structure. Inside, there is an earlier 7th or 8th century structure that was built on top of the original palace complex from the 4th century. So if you actually go in and you go below the street level, if you go down below the street level, there is her private chapel, which is preserved pretty much as it was in the 4th century. Still has beautiful frescoes that are still very, very colorful and beautiful, and incredible mosaics on the floor of that chapel, pretty much just as it was at her time. But this is where she brought back many of those relics to house them in her private chapel. Okay, her private chapel. And as I said, the original chapel, which is here, tiny little chapel, was actually consecrated in the year 326, specifically to house the true cross, the title of the cross. She brought back an entire nail. She brought back a piece of the cross of the good thief. She brought back part of the scourging pillar. These were what were originally housed in her chapel. Now, if you go down the subterranean level at Santa Croce today to her chapel, the relics are not housed there. They are actually housed today in a chapel on the main level. They were moved in the 7th or 8th century to the main floor. But certainly, if you ever go there, this is making a visit to her private chapel is certainly worth it. At that time, when she brought these relics back, the basilica floor she ordered covered with, or chapel floor she ordered covered with dirt she brought back from Calvary. So that's the reason it is called the Basilica of the Holy Cross in Jerusalem, in Rome, because she brought Jerusalem with her. And it's also thought that from Eusebius of Caesarea makes this point, that her bringing the soil of Calvary back to Rome was symbolically a way for her to unite the blood of Christ with the blood of Christians persecuted in Rome, that had been persecuted during the reigns, for instance, of Nero and Marcus Aurelius and Diocletian. That this was a symbolic way of uniting Christians together, the blood together. So that's kind of also a very, very beautiful tradition. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the, oh, I know what the other relic is. There's an index, part of the index finger of St. Thomas that was purported to be, and she didn't get this at Golgotha. She took this from Jerusalem somewhere else. But it's reported to be, of course, she claimed it was the finger with which Thomas placed in the wounds of the risen Christ. But that's also on display there. So, the true cross. I want to talk about that, the true cross. There's a lot of publications about this. Actually, it's an interesting field right now. There's a lot of study going on, measuring the pieces of the true cross. Some of them have been carbon-14 dated. Now, remember that, and we'll talk more about that in a minute, but carbon-14 dating is a destructive process. And so not many churches are going to permit their relics to be carbon-14 dated because it takes so much to do that. But there is an old sneer, you know, and some of you may have heard it, that there's enough wood of the true cross to build a battleship. You might have heard that. Okay, how many of you have heard that? Ever heard that?
No, I've heard one, there's enough wood from the true cross to build a cathedral.
To build a cathedral, okay. Well, I heard a battleship, but anyway, the point is the same, that there is lots of wood of the true cross that supposedly exist. So here's what's interesting. This was long ago nullified, and actually there's sort of renewed interest in this today, now that we sort of have a more instant access to information via the internet. But in 1870, there was a professor at the University of Paris, a man named De Fleury, who actually did an extensive cataloging of every single piece of the true cross known to exist in the world. He dedicated years of his life to this and measured, even by volume, okay, these pieces of the true cross. And he came up with, in 1870, came up with this was published in peer-reviewed journals at the time in France. It was published by the University of Paris, so you could look it up if you wanted to. His name is De Fleury. And he reported the actual volume, the amount he measured, and it is not near enough for one cross. It's not near enough for one cross. So, and we know that most of the fragments that are in existence in the world today, most of them have a pretty clear pedigree. I mean, we can sort of trace them back, maybe not to the 4th century, but we can trace them certainly to the High Middle Ages, most of them, and some before then. And, you know, again, it's like there's probably nothing that would guarantee their authenticity to someone who's determined to not believe it. There is no way to prove that it is. Like so many other relics, it comes down to a matter of faith and whether you believe that the object is worthy of veneration, right? And so if Helena did indeed find the true cross, it was through divine intervention. It was a miracle. It was not because of her archaeological expertise. And certainly, if the pieces of the true cross that are known to exist in the world today are in fact pieces of the true cross, then it was a miracle indeed. So, did I set that skepticism aside okay? You know, certainly, as I said, you can introduce doubt, we can introduce skepticism into any of these things that we choose to, and that is a choice to do that. All right, so one of the other things that she found is this, and y'all didn't see this photograph, okay? Because this is an illegal photo. Okay, so this has an interesting story behind it. It's called the Titulus Crucix, or the title of the cross. I'm going to read from John's Gospel. Pilate also wrote a title and put it on the cross. It read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Many of the Jews read this title, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, in Latin, and in Greek. Okay? I want you to note the order of that John places this in, the order of the languages. In Hebrew, in Latin, and in Greek. Now that's going to be important. So you know it was customary for the Romans to attach a small sign of some kind to a criminal. This is what they're guilty of. Oftentimes the criminal was expected to wear that around their neck on the way to crucifixion. Sort of stating what their crime was, a name and what their crime was. It was often just hung by the cross, placed by the cross, nailed to the cross, some way of publicly identifying who this person was. So a part of this sign, known as the title or the titulus, is kept as a precious relic in the church of the Holy Cross in Jerusalem in Rome, in that above ground chapel that we talked about, where the true cross is held also. The narrative proposed about it, or the narrative they will tell you about it there, is that she brought it back to the original subterranean chapel, and about 455, when the city of Rome was under threat by the Visigoths in 455, that many of these Passion relics were moved from there for safekeeping. And actually, the story about this one is that it was hidden. Not that it was taken, but that it was hidden. And so the board, the title, was apparently forgotten about until 1492. when there were some workers in the original chapel who discovered, when they pulled away part of a fresco, they found in the wall a sign that says Titulus Crucis on it in Latin. And behind that, they found this, that it was actually hidden in the wall and had been hastily covered up with some kind of other fresco, like plastered over and painted very quickly to hide it. Now that's the story that they will tell you there, okay? I'm not doubting it, I'm just telling you that's the story. We don't have any other independent corroborative story about that. So what covered it, as I said, was this, it was placed in a little niche in the wall. There is a stone that covered it that's inscribed Titulus Crucis. And I don't know if you can see this. We might have to take the lights way down to see this. Can anybody see that? It says Titulus Crucis. Do you see that? This is the stone that they found in the wall of the chapel that was hidden behind this more modern fresco in 1492. And it is written in classical Latin. All right? What's the difference between classical Latin and vulgar Latin? There's one thing you can notice immediately about this that will identify it as classical Latin.
U.
Right, there is no U in classical Latin. Classical Latin has 23 letters. There is no U, and there is also no lowercase letters in classical Latin. Everything is written in uppercase. Okay? So anyone who with a basic understanding of classical Latin would look at this and know that it was written, it was inscribed before the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. When you begin to see, by the early 5th century, you really begin to see more and more of vulgar Latin in use. So that's where this begins to take on some interesting connotations, as you will hopefully will see in just a minute. So back to the previous slide, I want to show you something. Again, go back to this. This board is walnut wood. It's walnut. It's an ordinary kind of walnut that grows throughout the world, throughout the Mediterranean basin. It is inscribed on one side with 3 lines, of which the first one is mostly obscured or mostly actually destroyed. The second line is written, so the first line is in Hebrew. The second line is written in Greek. And the third line is written in Latin. Now, do you remember the order that was given in John's Gospel? The order of the languages?
Yeah.
Somebody write that down?
Yeah.
Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. Okay. So the order of the languages was Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. That's the order that the evangelist, St. John, gives us. But the order of the languages on this title are not that. It is Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. And here's what's also interesting about it. The Greek line and the Latin line are both written in reverse script, just like Hebrew. Okay, so a Hebrew scribe, a Jewish scribe, who probably would be the one to make the title, right? He knows how to write the Hebrew, which is left to right. But he doesn't know how to write the Greek or the Latin, only the letters. So he puts them in left to right as well, in right to left as well. So they're actually in reverse order. Is this making sense? The Latin and the Greek, the Greek second line and the Latin third line are both written in the same order, the same reverse order as Hebrew. Well, this got the attention of some biblical scholars in the middle of the 20th century, who got very interested, first of all, wanting to carbon-14 date this particular wood, which has not been permitted. So the next thing they did was really turn to some linguistic scholars for some opinions about the language. And there's one man in particular, if you're interested, I can give you a follow-up name to read about. His name's Karsten Tiede, and he actually did a documentary about this. It's called The True Cross. It's available, I think A&E did it, I don't know, maybe a decade or so ago now. The True Cross was what it's called. And he's the one that proposed that this was in fact the authentic title, and he said he could prove how it was, because he said it would have been written by a Jewish scribe, someone probably unfamiliar with Greek and Latin, who would have written the Greek and Latin lines the same way they wrote the Hebrew, which kind of makes sense. And he also says it is not in the order that is given in the gospel. It's not in the order that's given in the gospel. It's given in another order. So he said, what medieval forger trying to pass off something as the legitimate title of the cross, what forger would not put the languages in the order they appear in the gospel account? If you're trying to pass it off as authentic, that's how you're going to do it. Well, this was his sole argument, because it's not in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. It's Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. As I said, it's not the same order of the languages. So he goes on to consult, as I said, some linguistic scholars who all sort of say that the languages as they appear here are certainly consistent with first century. There's no reason to believe that they are not. And actually the way that Jesus of Nazareth is written in the Greek actually points to an older date, because the person who wrote it in Greek clearly didn't know the Greek language. He used the same word in Hebrew in the Greek line. So he didn't really know the Greek. And then in 1997, there was a German historian and author by the name of Michael Hessemann, who performed some sort of further investigation of this particular relic. And he's the one who gave it to 7 paleographers, 7 separate paleographers in 7 different university settings. And by paleographers, these are people who study ancient inscriptions and ancient languages. And the consensus of all 7, from 7 different universities, was that this was a first century placard, essentially, and that they had no indication that this was a medieval forgery or late antiquity forgery, all dating it between the timeline of the 1st and 3rd century, with most of them saying 1st century. So by 2002, there was so much pressure put on for carbon-14 dating, as they were doing some carbon-14 dating of pieces of the true cross, that the curators of this permitted one tiny piece to be taken, and again, so the protocols in question, I'm just going to give you the information. Protocols in question, because there was apparently a very small sample taken. The carbon-14 dating that came back, published in a peer-reviewed journal called Radiocarbon, unlike the Shroud of Turin, whose carbon-14 dating has been widely disputed for reasons of violating its own scientific protocol. The area from which the sample was taken on the cloth, for instance, we've got lots of questions about the behavior of the scientists themselves. This is not really suspicious. This particular carbon-14 dating is not really suspicious other than the size of the sample taken. And, holding your breath, Radiocarbon published this, that it dated to the 11th century. Okay, so immediately, though, the scientists themselves qualified it by saying that it needed to be tested again. Now, here's the problem that we're left with so many of these relics. If it is indeed a medieval copy of the original, which perhaps it would be, perhaps she really did have the original, and there was a medieval copy made of it, which could be what this is. Maybe not an intentional forgery, just someone who wanted to copy it and preserve it. Why was it sealed behind a wall that's inscribed in classical Latin? Do you understand the conundrum? Does everybody understand? If it is a 11th century, 12th century forgery, why was it behind a wall that is inscribed in classical Latin, sealed, when classical Latin was lost by the 5th century? Why? That's a mysterious question. We know that St. Helena had something purported to be the title of the cross from the reports of pilgrims. And I want to go back to Etheria, her pilgrimage to Jerusalem in 384. She says that a title was shown there as one of the relics held in Jerusalem. She said, quote, a silver gilt casket. Again, she really notices the silver gilt. Have y'all noticed that? The silver gilt casket is brought out, which the holy wood of the cross is held. The casket was opened and the wood was taken out, and both the wood of the cross and the title were placed upon the table. Now that's from her original work, The Pilgrimage of Theory. It was in Jerusalem, she says, in 383. Eusebius of Caesarea tells us that the title of the cross, St. Helena had brought back to Rome. So these are not necessarily contradictory accounts. Do you understand? It could have been in Jerusalem in 383 and still could have been brought back to Rome at some future point. So what about the title of the cross? Is this really the title of the cross? Well, like the authenticity of any relic, we can't really pronounce that. I mentioned earlier that many of the pieces of the true cross have been carbon-14 dated. Some of them date to the 1st century. Some of them date to the 8th and 9th century. Again, carbon-14 dating is a destructive process. We know that in the High Middle Ages, and y'all heard me talk about this when I did a talk on relics last year. You may have heard me say this. We know that there was a wholesale trade in relics in the Middle Ages. We know that this practice was abused in the church. We can't deny that. We can't get away from it. Which is my question about this particular, the question I'm really left with about this particular object then. And something we'll talk about next week, very much about what hangs behind you here. In an age when there was such a wholesale trade in relics, when anything could be passed off to ignorant people, when you could go into a pasture and pick up the femur of a cow and pass it off as the bone of a saint, and people believed it, why would someone A, go to this much trouble, and B, not even make it look authentic? Right? And again, something we'll explore next week about the Shroud of Turin. If this is a 14th century forgery, why on earth would someone go to so much trouble when anything would have passed as the actual burial cloth of Christ? And oh, by the way, just happened to use technologies that wouldn't be available for 6 more centuries to do it. So, lots of questions, I know, and that is part of the mystery, isn't it? I mean, it really is part of what draws us in, is the mystery. It is the mystery that we're called to. So what about this miraculous story of St. Helena and the Passion relics? We hold these by tradition. By tradition. The miracle recounted by the Bishop of Jerusalem is solid testimony, people. A bishop of the church reporting a miracle. That is solid testimony. The finding of the true cross. Remember what St. Thomas Aquinas said about miracles? This is not a test question, but some of you who were here might remember this. St. Thomas Aquinas called miracles the authentic revelation of God. Authentic revelation. God's seal to his people is how he went on to describe it. So, yeah, I mean, we're left with all kinds of questions, and ultimately, I think at the end of the day, that can lead us 2 places. It can lead us to skepticism, or it can lead us to faith. Questions lead you one of those 2 places, right? So, to use a colloquial term that I think I used in here before, you know, we don't just throw the baby out with the bathwater. We would never be able to prove the authenticity of some of these things to the level, to the standard of proof that many people would expect. So, this really is an incredible story. The instruments of his passion, the story of St. Helena, where they ended up, and how we're talking about them here in 2018. So, that's all I got.